I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Paul Cripps, Production Designer for Apple TV Plus's critically acclaimed comedy Ted Lasso. So, Paul, Ted Lasso has a very filmic or cinematic quality about it in the way it's shot and edited, and particularly in the way that it looks and it feels. Can you talk us through some of the elements of your production design on the show that give that show that look?
I think the way we designed it was to give it quite a kind of wide vista in terms of a show, in that although we're in a space, well, we're in spaces a lot of the time that are quite closed in and interior. There's not a lot of windows in the training center that are designed, but we tried to give it a real kind of wide cinematic feel, incorporating a kind of self-lighting ceiling that you see quite a lot in the training center, and giving an ability to move around a set in a very fluid way. So there's a lot of camera movement. It's not so static as other kind of half-hour comedy shows, I think. We tried to build a composite set of the training center that allowed us to follow characters from room to room. The initial script had a lot of conversations on the move between spaces, and I wanted to get that feel that we could shoot 360 and allow the camera to wander with the characters around the spaces. There's also a lot of views between characters through windows, interior windows, and through doorways, and communication through different offices and spaces. So I suppose that was the main idea, basing the look around those spaces and making them try and feel cinematic, even though it's set in a very kind of, not an ordinary workspace, but it's a little bit like The Office or The American Office. It's a work-based kind of comedy, even though it's a football team, and many of us probably don't know what goes on behind the scenes in a professional football team. But it was just trying to make those spaces a bit more interesting in a way.
Yeah. Actually, I noticed it kind of reminded me of The West Wing, back in the Aaron Sorkin show, where a lot of people are talking and walking, and you've got a lot of interaction and fluid movement, as you mentioned. And I noticed it pretty quickly and thought, oh, wow, the cinematographer must be having lots of fun on this. But then I realized a lot of this has got to do with the design, because if you don't design this space properly, you can't facilitate that kind of movement and action. And I was just wondering, what's a really good example of that, of those composite sets? You mentioned that briefly, but can you take us into more detail on how you came up with the idea and then how it was actually executed?
Well, I think funnily you said The West Wing, and that is one of the references that I picked up on from the initial script. It did feel like people were having conversations on the move quite a lot. So it was the idea to build, although the studio isn't massive, we wanted to make as much space as possible for the composite set. So we have big sets, big rooms that you can move between. But that meant that we couldn't really have backings for windows. But also all the kind of Premier League football teams, I went to look at the offices, I went to look at the locker rooms, and a lot of them are very enclosed. They're interior spaces built within stadiums or built within spaces. And we didn't actually have a DOP and a director until quite late on. So I wasn't restricted by people saying, oh, we really need light here. And so I kind of let my imagination run, and I built in a kind of idea that we would see the lighting in the roof, in the ceiling. That would be partially how the scene were lit. And luckily the DOPs came and kind of bought into that idea. And I think they've made it look amazing. They've taken it onto another level because of the way they've used the lenses and the way they use the Ronin camera to move around. But I think it was a little bit of a gamble at the start, but it seems to have paid off. And I think the ceiling featuring heavily was, quite a nice idea. I mean, it was one of those things you see in like All the President's Men or whatever, where it becomes a feature of itself. But the other thing I really wanted it to do was to feel real. I didn't feel the comedy was coming from like a parody of a football team. I felt you had to kind of invest in the characters because Ted Lasso is a strange beast in that it has this extra element of heart in the characters. It's not just a work-based comedy. It's really about character. So I felt that the environment had to feel real, and you had to kind of buy into the belief of that. And then you would allow the comedy to come through the characters and the script rather than through the kind of set, as it were.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because the set and the look and feel of the show doesn't feel fabricated. It feels like you didn't even exist and they just plonked themselves into this real football club, and which is actually a really big compliment for you and your team, because it does feel so authentic. Which brings me to this. How much groundwork, apart from visiting offices of various football clubs, how much groundwork do you have to do on real-world English football and aesthetic and design to provide the show with that degree of authenticity?
Well, I think in England we're quite steeped in the game. It's such a big thing here. I mean, I'm a football fan. I think that was part of the thing that helped me get the job with Jason and Bill. So I knew that world, but obviously you don't know as much as you do if you worked in those spaces. So yeah, it's about research. It's about looking at it, how, and also placing the team. It's no good just looking at the big teams. I mean, the locker room is really based on Leicester City's locker room, and Leicester City are a small club, a bit like AFC Richmond, but 2 years ago they managed to win the Premier League, so they had a beautifully designed dressing room, but it had all these slogans like we do, so and graphics and colors. So it was really a case of researching it in the real world, but then also attempting. I kind of wrote, along with Brendan, one of the writers, we kind of created a history of the club, a kind of fake history, and some of that has filtered. Some of that came from the script, where we did an episode where there was a bit of a talk about what happened during World War One, and also in the initial pilot, with Rebecca talks about some of the history of the club. But Brendan had kind of had some stories about the past, and if you can build a mental kind of creation of what that team is, I mean, I know exactly where that stadium is, even though it doesn't exist in Richmond, and I know why Rupert bought it, because he cycled there between where he lived and where he went to college or whatever, and I did a mental route of why this team became what it is. And I think that really helped, because if I kind of believed the backstory, then I could kind of build all these things into the club, and it could feel real. And I think that's the same about the characters. They've built all these things into the character, and a lot of them are characters which take a different turn from what you'd expect. They're not exactly what you think you are, or you think they are. And I kind of wanted the club to undercut that, so it felt real.
Yeah, it really does. And the other aspect of the show, outside the football club, but more in the community, gives you a sense that this is a really working class place. It's steeped in tradition, and the fans were kind of like one of the antagonists of the show to begin with for Ted, until they eventually kind of accepted him. I'm just wondering what touches you brought to the design of the show to emphasize the location and community around the team.
Well, I think it's a mix of a choice of different locations. So we were lucky enough to have a connection to Crystal Palace Football Club, who play at Selhurst Park, which is kind of quite a working class part of London. So we were shooting at Selhurst Park Stadium, and Crystal Palace's colours are red and blue, and all the seats are red and blue. So that was a basis that we could start. So we made AFC Richmond red and blue, and we tied into their stadium, and it's surrounded by quite small scale red brick housing. But then also the other side of that is we film in Richmond, which is really kind of quite chic and expensive, and it's by the river. So I think the combination of those two things, they kind of sit quite nicely, because I think it looks beautiful, Richmond, but then also we have a bit more of the feeling of everyday London when we go to Crystal Palace. and various other locations. So I think it's a mix of things. But all those locations that we shoot in Richmond, quite a lot of them are actually in Richmond or Twickenham, and they're in a close area, and it kind of starts to feel like it is the world. And if you came to Richmond or Twickenham, you can go into the pub, although it's not the pub, it's my set, but you can go into the pub and have a drink, and you can sit on the green and you can see Rebecca's house from the green. So it does all actually link up in a strange way. And I think that kind of binds everything together into this weird mix of this show. It was quite sweet actually, because we originally intended to shoot in the interior of this pub, but then they also wanted me to build it for later episodes. But we never actually shot in the real pub. We shot the outside, but the rest of it is my set. But I found out that on the night the finale premiered, people had booked to sit in the restaurant or sit in the pub and have a beer or have a meal whilst they watched the last episode, which was really sweet, and when we film in Richmond, we get people who've come to Richmond to visit where Ted lives, and they see us filming. And it's a great thing that it's touched so many people that they would come and do that.
Yeah, doesn't it really? I mean, are you surprised at all when you get the feedback from people that they weren't expecting this show to hit them so hard in the gut in terms of their visceral, emotional reaction to these characters and their stories? Like, it really is quite a moving show, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I've listened recently this week actually to a couple of podcasts that people are doing about the show, and they've had people, write in with stories about how Ted, the show has affected them. And there's been some quite astounding stories. And I just think, wow, it's a TV show, but it's affecting that many people. I mean, I kind of had a feeling about it. I felt that there was something more to the show, which is why I love the script so much. But I never expected it to take off. I just thought it might be a bit too niche for everybody. But I think there's something about it. And I think lockdown is a particular reason also why it's been so good, because I think people have suddenly started to look at themselves and maybe I could be a bit nicer. And that's really encompassed in the show, really. It's about looking at yourself or looking at other people and just, asking questions about them rather than just accepting face value.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the core of the show, and that's what I took out of it. And you're right. Everyone being at home maybe forced them to watch a bit more TV, and then come across a show like this that, we devoured in days. So, Paul, look, congratulations on a great first season. Good luck for season 2. I know you're working on it now. And thanks for joining us today. We'll bring you back for our group chat.